I'll begin this afternoon's session with a brief introduction. Welcome to the Canadian Institute of Forestry's National Electronic Lecture Program. My name is Sharon Young, and I will be hosting today's session. Today is Wednesday, February 14th, 2024, and this is the second session in the e-lecture series entitled Sharing Knowledge on Some Key Initiatives Happening Across the Canadian Forest Service. This series is brought to you by the Canadian Forest Service and Canadian Wood Fiber Centre. The CIF-IFC is very pleased to collaborate and host these webinars. Today's session is titled Modeling Greenhouse Gas for 2 Billion Trees Afforestation and Reforestation Activities. Today we have Kathryn Fisher, who works as a carbon analyst with the carbon accounting team at Natural Resources Canada. She has been involved in developing methods to integrate 2 billion trees plantings into national reporting. Kathryn completed her master's degree in resources and environmental management at Simon Fraser University, and she has a background in biology. With that, I will now pass it over to Kathryn.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you to the CIF for hosting me today. On behalf of myself and the carbon accounting team, I'll be speaking to you about how we model greenhouse gas for 2 billion trees, I need to share my screen, don't I? For afforestation and reforestation activities. And why don't I share my screen? Okay. Hopefully you can all see that now. But first, before I start talking about our topic today, I'd like to introduce the Forest Carbon Accounting team of the Canadian Forest Service. Our team consists of research scientists, carbon analysts, spatial analysts, and software developers, and we work closely with our policy analysts and economist colleagues. Our role in the CFS is to model carbon stocks and carbon stock changes in Canada's forest ecosystems. A large portion of our work is to produce estimates for national carbon reporting and accounting deliverables. We support our scientists on researching forest carbon in many forms, from improving forest soil parameters to how forests can be used for mitigation benefit. Our team members are also collaborators in organizations such as the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions and provide mentorship in initiatives like Moja Global. But this talk is about a specific subset of the work we do, and that is greenhouse gas modeling for 2 billion trees, afforestation, and reforestation activities. It's impossible to talk about greenhouse gas modeling for 2 billion trees without first giving some context and an overview of the forest carbon and monitoring, accounting, and reporting system that we use. So I'll start with that. Then we'll shift gears and talk about the 2 billion trees program. I'll remind everyone what the 2 billion trees program is, what the goals are, and describe some of the planting activity that's taken place in 2021 and 2022. Then I'll bring the two ideas together and talk more specifically about how we're calculating greenhouse gas projections for the 2 billion trees program. I'll talk a bit about the methodologies we've developed, the factors we're considering, and some of the assumptions we've had to make to start with projections after only 2 years of planting. And finally, I'll share early results of our greenhouse gas projections so far, with the understanding that as our methods evolve, the results may shift. To ease us into this topic, I'll start with a brief review of forest carbon dynamics. Forests dynamically exchange carbon with the atmosphere through both sequestration and emissions. When forests remove carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, carbon is being sequestered into living tissues. Sequestration is driven mainly through forest growth, which can be impacted by forest conditions and management actions. Actions that lead to higher growth can drive additional sequestration, while actions or events that cause growth to slow or stop reduce sequestration. On the other hand, emissions are releases of carbon back into the atmosphere. There's many ways emissions can happen in a forest, such as annual processes, soil and cell respiration. There's leaf turnover and litter fall, which release carbon as it decomposes back into the soil. Natural disturbances, such as wildfire and insects, can release carbon to the atmosphere or create additional dead matter that will decompose. Human disturbances and the use and disposal of wood products can also lead to emissions. Canada uses a National Forest Carbon Monitoring, Accounting, and Reporting System known as NFC-MARS to track forest carbon dynamics across Canada's forests. The process starts with forest inventory records and yield curves provided by provinces and territories. This gives us a snapshot of the forest condition throughout Canada. We then receive activity data from multiple sources to layer in disturbances such as fires, insects, harvesting, residential firewood collection, and deforestation that change the distribution of carbon within the forest system. We use the carbon budget model of the Canadian Forest Service, known as the CBM, to integrate these data layers with ecological parameters developed by the scientific community to estimate past changes in forest carbon stocks and fluxes and to predict future changes in carbon stocks and fluxes. The CBM models carbon as a series of pools and alters the movement between pools based on the events that occur. When those events include harvesting, the carbon associated with the harvested wood gets transferred to another model called the Harvested Wood Products model that tracks the flow of carbon through commodities such as sawnwood, pulp and paper, and various bioenergy products. I won't spend very long here, but I did want to show a schematic of how the carbon pools are set up within the CBM. Estimating forest carbon dynamics is more than just estimating the growth of trees. There's multiple pools with different parameters representing how fast carbon moves between the pools, and it's this setup that allows us to track how carbon moves through the model. This design also helps us to meet international reporting requirements, which require that we report at a minimum the carbon in above ground biomass, below ground biomass, deadwood, litter, and soil. All of those categories can be met by grouping the pools shown on the screen. And on that topic, what are Canada's greenhouse gas reporting responsibilities? We are required to report both our historic and projected emissions. Our historic emissions are reported in an annual national inventory report. We adhere to reporting methodologies developed by the IPCC and submit the report to the UNFCCC each year in April. The report is backwards looking. We start with the condition of the forest in 1990 and layer on disturbances to create a time series of emissions. Each year, new disturbances are added, and we report up to the most recent data year, which is about 2 years behind the present due to the time it takes for data to be received and processed. We also report projected emissions biennially to the UNFCCC. These projected emissions begin where the historic-looking NIR, National Inventory Report, left off, taking the previous report and layering on projected future activities, including harvest volume and usage, residential firewood, industrial bioenergy, and mitigation activities out to 2050. The projections are factored into Canada's progress towards 2030 emission reduction targets. During years the biennial report is not created, we create an emissions projection report for domestic use. As part of our ongoing efforts to produce high-quality estimates of emissions, there's always ongoing improvement to the National Forest Carbon Accounting, Monitoring, and Reporting System, including to the CBM. We could spend this entire lecture reviewing the many scientific avenues being pursued to improve our estimates, but that's not the focus of today's talk. Various members of our team are working to reconcile differences in the carbon estimates derived from remote sensing and forest inventory methods, such as the CBM, develop climate-sensitive growth models, update soil and dead organic matter parameters within the CBM, incorporate new types of activity to better reflect forest management practice, and represent regional differences in emissions from harvested wood products. The CFS and the carbon accounting team are also exploring advances in understanding the mitigation potential of Canada's forests by quantifying wildfire emission reduction strategies, assessing the distribution of biomass for the bioeconomy, and looking at how the forest sector can contribute to the net zero pathways. All of the advances and progress that we're making are a results of better data and methodologies, scientific expertise, advanced models and the software developers to improve the models, and high performance computing. But I'm not really here to talk about all that, and I think there's been many other CIF lectures on several of those subjects. What I'm here to talk about is the 2 Billion Trees program and how we're integrating this new program into the larger forest carbon accounting and monitoring reporting system. It's a new program, and integrating it into the system has come with a new set of challenges for the carbon accounting team. The goal of the 2 Billion Trees program is simple and a little bit self-explanatory: to plant an additional 2 billion trees over 10 years over and above any existing jurisdictional requirements. This program has been identified as a tool in Canada's toolbox to support 2030 targets of the Paris Agreement and to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. However, there are other goals to planting trees as well, such as enhancing biodiversity and supporting human well-being, which are both incredibly important. In order to support all of these goals, there's a wide range of ways to plant trees under the 2 Billion Trees program umbrella. The program provides funding for public and private lands, rural, urban, and remote tree planting, funds for afforestation, reforestation, and restoration, among many other avenues. The program is set up under a 50-50 cost-sharing model, where 2 billion trees provides half the funds in most cases to proponents, though it will provide a higher percentage for Indigenous-led projects. In order to meet the targets, certain projects are ineligible for funding, including where tree planting would alter unique and protected ecosystems, such as some grasslands, where there are existing legal obligations that require trees to be replanted, on private land that supports business as usual forestry, as well as planting for carbon offsets. The program is a 10-year program with new data coming in every year. Projects are funded and go through a multi-step review process for eligibility. Then, proponents plant the trees and collect field data as required by the program. This field data is collected and managed by the 2 Billion Trees program team and includes information on, for example, the number of trees planted, which species, what the land was used for prior to tree planting, any site preparation that occurred, as well as many into the 100, well, not quite that high, many other fields, as well as spatial files with the location that the planting occurred. The 2 Billion Trees program team then distributes the data to the carbon accounting team for further processing. The carbon accounting team performs several QA/QC steps, including validating the spatial data against air imagery. Once the QA/QC on the data has been completed, the carbon accounting team can assess which sites are able to be integrated into the National Carbon Monitoring, Accounting, and Reporting System. Once the modeling is complete, these results are integrated into reports and communicated. The cycle then repeats for another data year. Throughout the process, we integrate new research to help us better improve our modeling. So far, 33,325 hectares of trees have been planted across 1,847 sites. However, of those total sites, not all of the sites are getting included in forest carbon greenhouse gas estimates, because as I mentioned, there are a lot of ways to plant trees under the 2 Billion Trees program, and not all of them result in a forest. For example, one of the pathways for tree planting under 2 billion trees is urban plantings, and the ecological parameters of the CBM are certainly not calibrated for urban trees. 219 of these urban sites were planted throughout 2021 and 2022, and these are excluded from our forest carbon modeling, although they do have many benefits, including sequestration, biodiversity, and improving human health. Similarly, 24 projects include planting shelter belts on cropland, and the carbon dynamics of these systems require separate models and aren't well represented by the CBM. Sites such as these urban and shelter belt sites are being modeled by different groups within Natural Resources Canada, Environment Climate Change Canada, and Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada. There were several other sites where QA/QC and spatial validation led to excluding them from the forest carbon greenhouse gas totals. But overall, of the 1,847 sites, our team determined that 30,898 hectares across 1,006 sites were either afforestation, which is the conversion of lands that have not been forests for 20 years or more to forest, or reforestation, which is the restoration of tree cover on forest lands temporarily devoid of trees. So far, there have been 175 afforestation sites across 1,423 hectares. Most of the afforestation activity to date has been in BC, New Brunswick, Ontario, and Quebec. For the sites where we were able to assess with confidence that the plantings were going to cause a land use change, most of the planting occurred on cropland, though responses were highly varied and many didn't fall neatly into a single category. For reforestation, so far we've seen 831 reforestation sites across 29,445 hectares. Similar to afforestation, we saw most of the early program activity in BC, Quebec, and Alberta. For some of the sites, the proponents provided us with site history details that allowed us to identify what was happening on the site prior to the reforestation plantings. Some reasons for reforestation we noted include planting after wildfire, which represented most of the reforestation sites, helping forests recover after severe insect damage, improving biodiversity by planting native species among plantation or ornamental species, filling gaps where floods or deactive roads disrupted forest connectivity, and planting an understory in an aging forest. So now it's time to talk about what we do with all these sites. I'm going to focus on how we integrate the sites into our emissions projections. The process is almost exactly the same as for our historic facing national inventory report, but there's some added complexity to the projections, so we'll talk about that. Before I start, I do just want to remind everyone that I'll be discussing only the forest greenhouse gas estimates for 2 billion trees. The urban trees are not modeled by the carbon accounting team, but are included in the emissions reports via a standalone model that was created by the Science, Policy and Innovation branch of the Canadian Forest Service. As I mentioned, there's 2 main categories of plantings that are included in the forest carbon emission projections. Reforestation, which as we've seen is the most common so far, and afforestation. Afforestation and reforestation plantings are now fully integrated into the National Forest Carbon Monitoring, Accounting, and Reporting System I described earlier, known as NFC-MARS. However, we've developed a process for identifying and tracking the records associated with the 2 billion trees plantings in our existing system. This may sound trivial, but it represented a large achievement on our team to integrate a separate flag for specific records within the existing inventory structure. For afforestation, integrating the new sites into the national inventory records simply meant creating new records because afforestation is creating new forest. However, the picture became more complicated for reforestation because reforestation, by definition, meant adding new trees to existing forest land. We couldn't simply add new records or we would double count the forest area. Instead, we had to find records in the existing inventory where there were no trees. We primarily targeted records where wildfires led to a regeneration delay, because we knew we had lots of post-wildfire sites, and directed the model to reforest these areas. We've also developed methods to include proponent-reported site preparation and initial biomass conditions into the carbon pools already existing in the CBM model, as I showed in an earlier slide, to include these factors in our greenhouse gas estimates of the sites. As I mentioned earlier, our projections report starts from the present year and looks out to 2050. In 2023, we had 2 years of program data. So we used our methods to translate the actual data provided by 2 billion trees proponents into our NFC-MARS system, as I just described above. However, because the projections report also includes mitigation activities, we add projected plantings in future years from 23 to 2030 based on program parameters, such as the projected areas derived from notional funding allocations and assumed implementation costs with planting types and locations. Because the trees from 2023, I guess they probably have now, because the trees from 2023 onwards had not been planted at the time we did this report, we also had to make reasonable assumptions, such as common tree species for the region of planting, the estimated yield curves they're going to grow according to, and assumed site preparation that proponents would use while planting these trees. In the projections report, we also want to assess the benefit of planting trees, which means we have to assess the planted trees relative to a baseline. What would have happened carbon-wise if the trees had not been planted? In order to answer this question, we had to come up with a way to understand what would happen on the 2 billion tree sites if tree planting had not occurred. For reforestation, though it was harder to integrate into our system initially, we were able to run 2 simulations to answer that question. We ran a simulation where we planted the reforestation trees for 2 billion trees, and a simulation where we did not plant them and let the inventory record recover naturally. For afforestation, we are currently using a baseline of 0 in that nothing happens on the site. However, we are collaborating with partners at Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada to develop baselines for non-forest land prior to afforestation tree planting. So hopefully we'll have a better idea of the carbon dynamics of the cropland or grassland that was growing there previously. The previous slide represents the methods we've been able to develop in the 2 years the program has been running. However, I'd also like to highlight that the greenhouse gas outcomes of a tree planting program like 2 billion trees can be affected by several and often interrelated factors, many of which I've shown on the screen. Program parameters such as funding allocation and planting costs can impact the regional distribution of planting and what type of planting occurs. And we know this can impact what species are available for planting and how well they're going to grow. Baseline conditions, such as the site history and soil conditions, may impact how well trees grow as well as what the carbon conditions on site and how much may be released into the atmosphere during site preparation. The species, as mentioned, the species of tree plant and its growth rate impact how much carbon is sequestered, while any site preparation or natural disturbances on the site may lead to carbon emissions from the soil or the trees themselves. I haven't even included how any post-planting activities can further influence greenhouse gas outcomes, but as the forest industry knows well, it can be very significant in terms of how trees are growing and sites are performing. Integrating as many of these factors as possible and more into our estimates of the greenhouse gas balance of the 2 billion trees program is our task in the coming years. We have preliminary estimates for site preparation emissions, but new research is ongoing and was recently published that we will be integrating. We're estimating growth rate, but the true growth curve of the planted trees likely won't be known for many years. As I mentioned earlier, we're collaborating with partners to improve our understanding of pre-existing site conditions and understand how to incorporate disturbance risk and permanence of these trees on the sites. However, given all of that, we are proud that we've been able to generate estimates for the greenhouse gas projection trends for the 2 billion trees, afforestation, and reforestation, which I'll share. Here are the emissions and sequestration estimates for 2 billion trees afforestation sites. This includes the trees actually planted by the program for 2021 and 2022, as well as projections based on funding allocations for 2023 forward. It compares against a baseline of 0, and as we make improvements to our modeling methodology, it will cause our estimates to shift either up or down. The annual emissions estimates are on the chart on the left, and the cumulative impact is on the right. For both charts, positive numbers refer to emissions and negative numbers refer to sequestration. The units are in tons carbon dioxide equivalents, which is a unit that we can use to have apples to apples comparisons of carbon estimates. The first thing to notice here is that for the first decade of the program, we see emissions from the planted trees. The initial emissions are because in the first years of tree growth, they are not sequestering much carbon yet. They are very small. As well, this estimate includes site preparation and the soil respiration that occurs on site. It's not until 2033 that we see the annual balance tip towards sequestration, and it's not until 2038 that the cumulative impact of the plantings becomes net sequestering. However, the long-term impact of the afforestation planting is close to 35 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents sequestered by 2050. And here are the emissions and sequestration estimates for the 2 billion trees reforestation sites. Again, this includes trees actually planted by the program for 2021 and 2022, as well as projections based on funding allocations for 2023 forward. For reforestation, we're able to run 2 scenarios in our existing system, and the difference between the simulations represents the net mitigation benefits, which are the green bars on the right axis. Similar to afforestation, for the first decade of the program, we see emissions from the planted trees also due to incorporating site preparation relative to natural regeneration. In the case of reforestation, the trends are driven by the difference in the yield curve that already exists in our NFC Mars system and the new curve we've added to represent 2 billion trees plantings. We actually see the balance towards sequestration shift a little sooner to 2030, but overall reforestation is less impactful on a per hectare basis in the long term because of the baseline that trees will grow back even if no planting occurs. Well, the absolute numbers on these charts show more mitigation from reforestation. Remember that we had close to 30,000 hectares of reforestation and only under 2,000 of afforestation. So the per hectare values currently highlight that afforestation is more effective as a mitigation activity. Again, as our methods improve, these numbers may shift. So what's next? We've had a busy first 2 years developing our initial methodologies, but as I've mentioned, our methods are constantly being refined. We're looking to refine our site preparation disturbances to better assess how site preparation impacts the carbon movement on site, and if any of it is released to the atmosphere or into different carbon pools with different decomposition rates. We're looking to develop baselines for afforestation to understand what we should be comparing the planted trees against. We're looking to improve our growth curve estimates as we get information about how the trees are growing. And we'll be collaborating with other departments and scientists to do all of this. We're also in the process of developing a plan to monitor the site's performance over time. This is going to, as I said, we need to understand how these trees are going to be growing, not just now, but in the years after they're planted. And we will likely be using remote sensing as a large component of assessing the performance of these sites. We get a new round of planting data to integrate each year, and we'll continue to learn from these sites about the carbon dynamics of young forests and how we can best model them. Thank you, and I'll take questions.
Thank you, Kathryn. That was a great presentation. So looks like we don't have any questions in the Q&A pod at this moment. I'm not sure if people are still typing, but I do have a post-webinar survey for our participants to fill out. So I'm gonna activate it now. So there are 2 questions in this survey. You may need to scroll down to see the next question. And I'm gonna leave this survey open for a minute. Oh, looks like we have a question now. So Kathryn, if you're ready, here's the first question for you. So while wildfires have been increasing in intensity and frequency across Canada, if an area where 2 billion tree program seedlings have been planted burns, will the greenhouse gas projections be adjusted to address these changes?
So right now, we are not currently including wildfire in our projections. However, as I mentioned, there is a historic greenhouse gas report as well, and we do include wildfires in that report. So the change in the, so if a site burns, that will get reflected in the National Inventory Report. We are looking towards methods for projecting fire in the projections report, but that's an incredibly complex process to implement. And so fire is not currently included in our projections report. And I think if Ben wants to chime in here as well with more details, feel free. I see, I'll just start answering. I see the list. I will just, unless, yeah. Ben, did you want to jump in on the fire question?
Sorry, I just thought Ben would add in
no. I just wanted to let him know that he's definitely welcome to jump in if he has more details he'd like to share.
Okay, so now let's move on to the next question. So will you be sharing the carbon calculations or projections for each site with the grantees that planted them?
At the moment, we're including projections in our national reports at an aggregated level for privacy reasons. If grantees are interested in the results, we may be able to work with them to develop a process to get those values, but we would have to negotiate that with the 2 Billion Trees program administrative team as well to ensure that that's a feasible option.
Okay, so next questions for Kathryn is, how does survival of the seedlings play into the modeling? First and second year mortality can occasionally hit 20 to 30% in some cases.
That's a great question. That is something that we are actively working on incorporating. So one of the things that we're able to do is that we do know that a lot of growth and yield curves have some level of mortality built into them, but the bulk of this question is going to be answered by our remote sensing program. We can go back and adjust our estimates for the trees over time. We do have a process for revisions in particularly the historic National Inventory Report. So this is one of the items that as our remote sensing and monitoring program kicks in, that we're going to be looking deeply into this question because we know that this is a big factor in young trees.
Moving on to the next question. Are post-harvest reforestation and post-wildfire reforestation growth curves different?
These are all great questions. At the moment, they are not. That is one of, again, as I mentioned, we could spend a whole lecture talking about the advances that we're hoping to make. This is just reflected kind of 2 years of work so far. And again, we are aware that there can be some differences here, and we are hoping to integrate updates to the growth curves kind of in a bunched basis within the next, well, sometime during the administration of the modeling of the program. So again, we have to make sure that we have accurate growth curves for all of these sites. Right now, it's we don't actually have access to too many growth curves. So we also have to take into account what species are being planted, where they're being planted. There's a lot of factors that grow into what the estimated growth is going to be. And we just, at this time, are still developing our capacity to add that kind of variety.
Thank you, Katie. So next question for you is, you mentioned understory planting. I know of one trail in Boreal, Alberta that was abandoned due to high cost, many seedlings eaten by rabbits, and damage to roots of surrounding trees if heavy equipment used. How will you monitor the success of this method?
Actually, can I answer that in combination? I'm just looking ahead and I can see the next two questions are also based on a monitoring plan. So I'm going to address all three of those in one go. This is under active creation right now. We are working on identifying what success means, because it will likely mean something different for afforestation plantings, reforestation plantings. And even though the urban and agricultural plantings are not going into our forest greenhouse gas inventory, we also do need to understand their success, and they are getting modeled in different ways. So there's all of these types of plantings may have different metrics for success. And so we are working with a team right now to understand, first of all, how to quantify success. Is it free to grow? That may not make sense for urban trees. So to quantify success in monitoring for the different types of planting is something that is being done right now. So that's, as for the methods we're actually going to be using, it will be the carbon accounting team, along with another initiative that's going on to improve our forest carbon, or improve our understanding of forest inventories and data availability. So there's a larger initiative going on within the Canadian Forest Service to have a better handle on how we're understanding the condition of the forest in Canada, and the remote and the monitoring program will likely fall to some degree under that umbrella. But the specific sampling program and techniques are being worked on as I speak to you right now. They will likely involve some kind of drone survey, but again, we don't have fixed methods for that quite yet. Stay tuned for another couple months.
Okay, keep going. Next question for you, Katie. Is there an annual report that is completed for the 2 Billion Trees program?
There is. The 2 Billion Trees program puts together a results report. We provide some information to it, but we are not involved in the writing and release of that report. But if you can get a hold of the 2 Billion Trees program team themselves, they'll be able to provide more information on that report. It is more generally a summary of the types of planting, as well as other indicators such as plantings toward restoration, urban plantings, and they have their own suite of indicators that they're looking at to report the program. And greenhouse gas emissions are one element of that program. I'm actually not sure, Ben, if that report is being released at the time. It again has a delay from when the data is collected to when the report gets produced. And I'm actually not exactly sure what their schedule is for production.
Something to check with the 2 Billion Trees.
Absolutely.
Okay, next question. Oh, Katie, you may answer this already, but our participants missed the answer. To what level is the planting data aggregated?
Right now we're aggregating at the national level for emissions, and we've aggregated at the province level for area planting right now, and that's what for privacy reasons, we're not going to be disaggregating further than that anything. Because yeah, there's lots of landowners, and we need to ensure that privacy is respected.
Okay. Next question. What is the smallest unit of area that will be modeled?
That's a great question. It depends a little bit on the type of planting. For some of the shelter belt sites, if they're just a really long, narrow strip, again, we're not doing that. And this also depends a little bit on, this is part of what we're looking at in some of our quality assurance and quality control checks, because in order to convert to a forest or to be a forest, there is a minimum size requirement. However, if a planting is adjacent to a forest and it will join up to that, we can model that as part of the surrounding forest. So I don't have a fixed answer for you on what the smallest unit area of being modeled is, because it really depends on the surrounding land use and the type of planting.
Okay, last question for you, Katie. We are having serious issues finding silviculture workers in New Brunswick. Is there any plan to recruit new workers to reach these higher tree planting targets?
I can't speak to exactly how how some of these metrics are. I do believe employment is an indicator that is reported on when proponents apply to the program, but I can't speak further than that on how recruitment is going. That's a separate area of the program than I'm part of.
No worries. Thank you, Katie, for answering all the questions. So if there are no more questions, I would like to bring this session to a close. Thank you all for participating in our CIF electronic lectures. And once again, thank you very much to Kathryn for today's session. I will see you guys next week. All right. Bye, everyone.